Not outrage, not spectacle, patient attention. Every line is a hinge, every breath a witness.
Time can be tuned until questions cost too much to ask.
No drama, only competence. As it was, as it mustn't always be. Lenses baptized as relics. Questions in chains becoming altars.
A city reassured by likeness. But likeness is not truth.
For the next 2 hours, keep your own time.
If this kind of quiet, investigative bedtime tale helps you drift off, take a slow breath and settle in. Follow, save, or share this episode so the next page is waiting when you return. Tonight, we'll read softly, question gently, and let the past speak in a voice just above a whisper. Ready? Let's open the chronicle together. I used to believe that silence was the same thing as holiness, that the hush of a sacristy or the wordless patience of a reading room meant God was listening. I believed it because I had to. It was what we were taught to believe, and I was good at being taught. They gave me keys shaped like crosses and shelves, heavier than judgment, and told me I would be a librarian. But I learned quickly that the job described itself poorly. Librarian sounded like someone who let light in. What I became was a keeper of shutters. The first time I touched the ledgers in the cold underbelly of those marble steps, where the air smelled like iron pennies and candle smoke, I felt how the bindings tightened at my fingers, as if the books were bracing themselves. No one tells you that a book can recoil. No one tells you that it can remember who last read it and how much was taken. I kept an index no one was allowed to see. I wrote it in a cipher made of ordinary letter forms, so that, to the casual eye, it looked like nothing more than a thicket of titles and accession numbers. But between the lines, in the discipline of spacing and the habits of the hand, I tucked the real entries like blades into the hem of a robe. The chained volumes were listed under the guise of devotional miscellanies, their edges dark with generations of fingers that had pretended not to recognize them. There were calendars annotated in red, with days that never happened. Their saints, given festivals that smelled of smoke and rain, and then quietly recalled as scrivener's error. There were registers of bishops whose seals were pressed so deeply into wax that the wax turned to a kind of stone, and yet their names never quite managed to sit still on the page. They slid and trembled when no one watched. I learned to watch without blinking. The room where I worked was called the submararium by those who liked jokes, because it sank beneath every known plan of the basilica and curved where geometry insisted it could not. There were doors where there should have been walls. There were walls where a door waited if you stood and stared long enough with unasked questions. You could hear water if you put your ear to the stone, though the Tiber ran at a distance, and you could hear, too, the faintest suggestion of singing, a breath that never quite formed into voices, as if the air had been a choir once and still kept the muscle memory of harmony. The scribes before me had scrubbed away the brass plaques, but one silver plate remained, hammered and rehammered until the motto beneath could not be fully buried by scratches. Memoria regitur. Memory is ruled. Not kept, not honored. Ruled. You will say I should have refused, but refusal is a tempo, and there the tempo belonged to someone else. I catalogued, because cataloging was a way of being near the forbidden without ever claiming it. I numbered, because numbers are a neutral cloak. I stamped the vellum, turning the face of a lamb into receipt paper, and pretended not to see how the text winced. They sent me visiting lecturers whose noses twitched at dust and whose eyes were keen on the visible, and I escorted them to respectable shelves where nothing ever happened. I learned the gate of keys. I learned how to make my footsteps sound like someone else's. A monk, old as unvarnished oak, once leaned his shoulder against a pillar next to me and said he'd been to a burning when he was young. He said he'd watched a scholar with a face like a plowman's throw her own notes into the flames ahead of the bailiff, and the monk, because God still had his back turned then, could not stop himself from asking why. "Because I promised not to let them edit me," she said, and he laughed like a bell hit wrong. "We don't burn now," he told me, lifting an eyebrow the color of ash. "We drown. We drown in catalog entries that mean nothing. We drown in footnotes. We drown in indexes that are faithful like knives." He died that winter of a cough that sounded like torn paper, and when I went to write the note of his passing in the register, the space was already full of an empty line someone else had entered. After night prayers, when the lamps down in the submararium went to their tiny, steady sleep, I stayed. I stayed because the books never slept. They lay awake like animals in winter who know their breath is a lamp they cannot afford. I took off the glove on my right hand and pressed the pad of my index finger to the tiny ridges in the leather where years had left their resonances. I came to know the atlas of touch, the map of the pressure marks left by strangers who had asked questions no one else would write. You can feel a good question long after you've forgotten the answer it pulled from the world. That is the first true confession I can make. I learned the chained shelf by scent as much as sight. There was a gospel attributed to a man named Thomas, but not the Thomas you know. The prologue was a map to a sermon that could only be delivered under a sky that had eaten the moon. In the margins, iron gall ink traced star positions and cross-referenced them with the appointments of men dressed in white who existed but did not reign. This was not the usual apocrypha of pious invention. This was municipal astronomy, calendar as indictment, a small hand, perhaps a woman's, by how it favored its loops, had drawn an ellipse around a line that said, in a tidy Latin, that the day between 2 days had been stolen and returned to the treasury as a jubilee. I followed her circle with my nail until I felt the paper become a security fence. Ask me if I told anyone. Ask me if anyone could be told. There were lives there, pressed flat and salted like cod for long voyages. A physician who renamed his experiments miracles because the price of failure was paid by the century that hosted you. A painter whose signature evaporated between one summer and the next, leaving a school where a name should have been, so that prosperity could be collected by those who framed paintings rather than those who painted them. A queen whose letters were cross-hatched with denials that convinced no one and satisfied everyone, because satisfaction was cheaper than truth. The pages breathed. When the bindings creaked, the sound was not dissimilar to a door reconsidering its decisions. You will want to know how the staircase opened. You will imagine a mechanism, a rook's move hidden in a tile, a hinge disguised as a saint's halo. But the truth is less clever and more cruel. The wall opened because the wall had always been a door for those who were willing to touch it, as if it could be forgiven. The silver plate above the arch had been hammered flat and hammered again, so that the letters of the motto were more memory than inscription, and the silver had grown warm, which is impossible for metal in such a room. I had been copying a ledger all afternoon, a ledger that assigned missals to provinces and provinces to hands, and hands to obedient mouths. And when I stood, back sore, eyes like whetted flint, I pressed my palm to the plate, because human beings are capable of breathtaking mistakes when no one is watching. The plate remembered me, or it remembered someone I resembled 6 lifetimes ago. The stones took a breath. The seam between 2 blocks became what it had been waiting to become. You descend because gravity is persuasive, and also because you can only go forward into the confession you have already begun. The steps were narrow. The lamp threw down a weak citrus of light that rolled ahead like a coin dropped in a well. The air smelled not of decay but of ideas laid up in salt, ideas still dangerous enough to require mummification. There was a tapestry at the first landing, flayed of its weft in some places and overgrown with a slick nap of age in others. It depicted a sword across a firmament of pinprick stars, and the blade's fuller was a tiny road down which script marched in formation. The words would not settle into any language I recognized until my breath slowed to the pace of prayer, and then they trod into focus. Gladius consecratus, a consecrated blade. Above the blade, stitched with a kind of furious neatness, was a hand. The hand belonged to no saint I could name. The hand was not cut by a stigmata but a ledger's edge. Below, the corridor ran like a page ruled by a careful teacher. The walls wore planks of ash wood, each plank engraved with dates whose numerals had the delicacy of knuckles. I put my hand flat to a section where the years 614 and 911 argued with each other without words, the way couples in a long marriage do. The wood pulsed back like a heartbeat that had forgotten which body it belonged to. Time is not a river if you go far enough down. It is a cistern. You can lower a bucket. You can pull up more than you should. They have a rumor upstairs that everyone laughs at until someone is left alone with it. That certain centuries were slipped into the calendar like counterfeit coins into a church box, such that when the tally was taken at dusk, the numbers comforted, the counters, and betrayed the day. They call it the phantom time hypothesis, and it serves the useful purpose of sounding foolish enough to be dismissed out of hand. Down there, where the air knew how to sustain notes that no lungs could manage, the rumor wore an alb and carried a stamp. It was procedure. It was implemented. You know that we replaced one calendar with another because drift offends the feasts of men more than it offends the planets. You know about the octave of days subtracted and the days repositioned the way you might move chairs around a table to accommodate a guest no one invited. What you do not know, what I did not know until the corridor taught me, was that calendars have margins, and margins can be used to hide contraband. A day moved here means a charter there acquires legitimacy, because its seal now falls on a Thursday, and a Thursday means the magistrate who signed it was in town. A week trimmed off there allows an act that occurred on a feast of light to retroactively occur in a season of scarcity and excuses the cruelty that followed. Jubilee years can be engineered as pressure valves for centuries that have been asked to hold steady under bad math. The blade lay on a pedestal of oak that had fossilized into something more honest than wood. The steel did not shine. Shining is a trick of surface. This sword refused the trick. It drank the light instead, like a man who does not drink to forget but to remember privately. The wrappings pretended to be leather until they touched the skin and remembered they were older. Along the fuller, the tiny road muttered to itself in a script that had no right to exist and every right to be there. The grammar was an oath. The sentence was a debt. I did not pick it up. You do not pick up a thing that weighs more than gravity. I bent, instead, and read out loud, but softly, the way you read the names of the dead when you're not sure who can hear you. The lamp flame leaned toward the notch of my breath like a flower finding its sun. The corridor fell very quiet. Then, as if the stones in the walls had exhaled after holding their breath since the last voice, the air made the sound of a choir inhaling before their first note. No voices followed, just breath. It was worse. I found ledgers beside the pedestal, their pages sugared from being turned with hands that no longer took salt on their bread. The first ledger was all public legend, the story no one tells for fear of sounding like a child, except that it was written with the cold economy of a receipt, a crusader's sword, a heretic king, a sky that bleached white like linen in sudden sun. The second ledger was all gloss, annotations that did not dare to contradict the legend, and yet threaded it into a tapestry it never intended to be. The sword was consecrated, yes, but consecrated not to a deity, but to a covenant about a deity, a grammatical difference with the appetite of a beast, an oath to excise memory that inconvenienced the power who prayed over it. If you placed its edge on the altar and spoke the math of the vow correctly, pages elsewhere lost ink. A chronicle in Cairo misplaced a dynasty. A parish register in Provence shed a year and called it pestilence. A painter's signature became school of, and his lunch went unpaid for 3 towns over 4 generations later. The ledgers did not dramatize, they presented. Books are better at bureaucracy than bodies are. They behave when you ask them to line up. They do not cry in the night. I turned the pages, and the squeak of the leather bands in their staples felt like a confession being dragged along the floor. Every time my eye reached the margin, I expected a flourish, a satisfaction, a kind of ornament that would make the horror polite. There was none, just dates, matched to papal seals like teeth to bite mark. Lunar tables adjusted with a precise grace that made the adjustments impossible to resent until you traced them to the oath, to the altar, to the blade, and then you could resent nothing else. Up in the library, above ground, there's a habit people have when confronted with an inconvenient fact. They draw a box around it on the page. A rectangle of pencil lead becomes a fence, and the eye walks around the fence politely and continues its way down the column. The ledgers had learned the trick in reverse. They drew no boxes, they smiled invisibly, and let you wander through, unaware you had been robbed. I put my palm down, flat, to stop the pages from turning themselves and felt how warm the paper had grown. Warmth in those rooms is theology. It means some living engine is present where no living thing may be. If you have never been trained to handle a relic, I do not recommend improvisation. There are ways of moving the air around it so that you do not accidentally wake the things that rest beneath it. Ways of touching wood that has decided to behave like remorse. Ways of speaking over metal that has been taught to pretend it doesn't understand you. I had learned by watching. The blade wanted vows the way dry ground wants rain. It could smell promises. I had none left that I was willing to part with. That is not the same thing as having none at all. The phrase that ran along the fuller refused to translate as long as I stared at it. Some languages do not reward staring. They reward listening backward, as if the word had been spoken just before you arrived and you can only catch its echo. I closed my eyes. I let the lamps breathe without me. I let the quiet inventory me like a taxman. Gladius consecratus, yes, but not simply a holy object. consecrated as an instrument, a tool that trims not flesh, but edits the world along the spine of convictions. The breath of the unheard choir stirred, and I understood that I stood inside the confessional ledger, that the room itself was an account book, and I was being written into it as a variable whose value had not been decided. There is a tenderness that comes over you when you finally admit that you have been used as a shelf. It is not the tenderness of pity. It is a kind of technical compassion, like a surgeon's for a part of a body that never learned it was allowed to heal. I thought of the monk with his ash eyebrow, and the scholar who burned her notes rather than let them be edited. I thought of the little ellipse in the Thomas prologue, the tidy Latin hand that had circled theft disguised as celebration. I whispered the lost feast days to myself to see if the air would change color. It did not, but the lamp steadied, and the fat of the wick grew a little crown. They will paint you as paranoid if you speak of such things with your inside voice turned outward. It is easier for everyone if the word conspiracy means nonsense that flatters fools. But a conspiracy is just a togetherness with a purpose, and the purpose here was not mysterious at all. It was accountancy. It was editorship. It was ledger-keeping made liturgy, the order behind orders. The ones who taught the blade to drink ink rather than blood had a name that refused to settle on my tongue at first, a name made of balance and scales and the plain arithmetic of obedience. Custodes, aquari, the keepers of the balance. Not balance as in justice, but balance as in books. When curiosity gains interest, they collect. If a question threatens to compound into knowledge you might lend to another, they foreclose. Inquisitions look dramatic, and that is their wage. They pay for themselves by frightening the curious for a generation or two. The real work of forgetting is quieter. It happens in acquiescent classrooms, and in the cupboard where the stamp ink is kept and where the clerk learns to refill it without thinking. It happens in the mouth when you choose a synonym that offends one fewer donor and watch how the sentence learns to limp. It happens in prayer when silence is confused with reverence long enough that no one remembers how to ask a hard question without blaspheming. I did not sleep that night, though time moved like someone carrying a bowl of water in both hands, careful not to spill. Downstairs, the ledgers waited. Upstairs, the basilica drew its breath and held it until tourists arrived to exchange their stares like currency. Between, I rehearsed how not to be who I had been. You do not stop being a gaoler simply by losing your keys. You unlearn by degrees. You listen to the stones the way stones listen to you. You put your palm on metal as if you were the one being forgiven. When the bells gathered themselves for morning, the air down below was no less cool, but I understood its temperature the way a swimmer understands a lake he will enter. The corridor of dates accepted the soft of my steps. I did not have a plan. Plans are the scaffolding of fear. I had only this, to witness, and in witnessing, to consecrate memory in a way that could not be trimmed without a fight. The ledgers contain a simple cruelty. What is not witnessed is easily edited. So you will forgive me for speaking to the stone, for reading out loud to air, for telling walls what I found in margins. It is not madness to tell what you love that you have seen it, and if I tell you now that the sword whispered back, you must understand what I mean when I say whisper. I do not mean a voice with consonants like pebbles and vowels like velvet. I mean that the weight of my body on the stones felt suddenly matched by another weight that chose to trust me with its gravity. The phrase along the fuller combed itself through my mind as a mother might comb a child's hair before a portrait. You may rule memory, it said without saying, but you will never own it. Ownership is a human fantasy. Rule is a human habit. Memory belongs to breath. I stood there too long. I was seen by no one. The room did not mind. It knows how to cradle the long and the too much. It has cradled centuries. No one will volunteer to hold. I put the ledgers back the way a guilty man returns a borrowed coat, careful to smooth the shoulders, careful to find the weight of the old owner in the lining. I did not take the blade. I would not have trusted myself with it. But I took the vow the room asked me to take, the only vow left to someone who has learned what ledgers are. This vow: to read aloud what has been circled in a tidy hand, to trace where a feast day was stolen and returned as a dividend, to ask why a painter's signature should evaporate and who profits when it does, to call a miracle an experiment when the experiment is the more dangerous word. When I climbed back up, stones breathing their slow, patient breath, the silver plate was not cool and not hot, but alive in the way a hand is when it has just let go of another hand it did not expect to hold. Upstairs, the hush was benign again, the kind of silence people mistake for God. I could hear the routine keys like rosary beads, footsteps like pen strokes, doors exhaling into their frames. In the register, I wrote a line that looked like a line that had always been there. In the cipher between my alphabets, I wrote the truth, which is this: I have entered the ledger that thought it could inventory me. I have read the oath that trims. I have heard air breathe. I have learned what the blade trims and why. I have learned that the most dangerous thing to them is memory, coming home. If you think this is melodrama, tell me your favorite century, and I will ask it a question it cannot answer with the facts you have been given. I will ask it about the week that disappeared, and the harbor that moved, and the man who wore white and did not rain. I will ask your century to show me the painter it remembers as school of, and then I will bring you to the little mark on the edge of a gospel where a woman's hand circled an eclipse that was not of the moon. The page will smell like dried blood. Your lamp will lean. You will find that you do not require me to be there afterward, which is the only proof I can offer that I am not trying to convert you to anything but your own stubbornness. This is how confession begins, then, not with repentance, which would imply a crime that could be settled by a ledger, but with a declaration that the ledger no longer owns your breath. I will tell what I have been told to forget. I will ask what I have been trained to ignore. I will do it quietly, because quiet lends weight to words that have too long been skittish. I will do it carefully, because careless revelation is just another way to ruin a page. I will do it as if my voice were a small lamp leaning toward ink that would like to run. If I vanish, as men vanish when they have put their palms to plates that were never meant to be warm, the tape will know how to make a room of itself. It will teach the air to breathe. It will lead you down. And so, with the morning laid out upstairs like linen on a long table, and the submararium below me like a second set of lungs, I begin with the simplest inventory. My name no longer fits my collar, but it fits this page. My hands don't shake when I write. The ledgers exist. The corridor breathes. The blade drinks light without swallowing it whole. The balance they keep is not the balance that keeps the world honest. It is the balance that keeps the world comfortable. The motto is real. The doors are the kind that remember who you wished you were. The books do not sleep. Silence was never sacred. It was enforced. And now, as I write this first chapter, in a voice just above a whisper, the rule they kept for memory loosens by the width of a breath. That is all it takes to begin. I did not mark the hour when I went back, only the angle of the light above the stair, the way it thinned as if pulled through a needle. The silver plate remembered my hand without hesitation this time, which frightened me more than resistance would have. Stones do not learn quickly. When they do, someone has been tutoring them. The descent refused to be counted. I tried 10, 20, 30 steps, but the numbers came back with dents, like coins rubbed thin in too many palms. The lamp pooled its small gold over my knuckles and trembled when the hallway exhaled. Beneath the first landing, the temperature fell into a kind of thoughtful cold, not hostile, but the kind that asks if you have brought good reasons. The corridor waited like a page. Ash planks paneled the walls in long ribs, and on each rib an incision of dates, not inked, but incised, as if time had to be pressed into the wood to hold still. My finger found 614 and felt the faint give of sap deep within a thing that should no longer remember water. I traced forward until 741, and the measurement of the years turned elastic, the cut numerals softening under my skin. Doubt is a softening, too. Perhaps that is why this place used it as material. I learned the corridor's grammar slowly. Each section presented a triptych, a public feast or council named in crisp capitals. Beside it, a symbol knifed so shallowly you could miss it, unless the lamp aligned a crescent, a square, a 5-rayed star, and opposite, a number in red that was not a year and not a day. The red numbers were intervals, deltas, notations of how much time had been made to behave. A week borrowed so a harvest charter could be backdated to satisfy a noble, 2 days shaved from the octave of a funeral, so that a war could officially start on a Sunday. The red numbers were accounts, and I was standing inside a ledger that had learned to masquerade as a hallway. The first door on the right admitted me like a footnote, a parenthetical room with a table of stone and a box of iron smelling faintly of salt. Inside the box lay calendars, a dozen small codices, each the work of a province Burgundy, Apulia, Thrace, each annotated in 2 inks. The brown ink recorded seasons, saints, eclipses, tides, births. The black ink performed minor surgeries, excisions so neat the scar looked like ornament. Next to each change, the sign of a cross with the horizontal bar extended, as if the cross itself had to balance a sum. I have seen scribes correct their own arithmetic before. This was not correction. This was policy. In Apulia's book, a feast of light moved 3 days forward, so the bishop's sermon would coincide with the arrival of a reliquary that had been delayed by storms. In Burgundy's, a famine winter lost 7 days to an indulgence that didn't arrive until the thaw. Thrace showed something stranger, a day added that no one mentioned again, as if a guest had sat at table and never been introduced, never been invited to speak, and yet the plates all shifted to make room. I laid the 3 next to each other, and the pages warmed where they touched, the way bodies do when they share a secret on purpose. There was an instrument on the wall, a thing like a sextant, married to a monstrance, its central disc etched with constellations. No one admits are constellations anymore. A pin, along its perimeter, could be slipped into holes labeled with reigns rather than years. If you set the pin to the reign of a certain innocent man, and pivoted the arm to a certain star, the disk clicked, and the entire device advanced by a week. On a slate beneath it, marks suggested that someone had tuned several rains to several stars, as if the heavens were not guidance but leverage. I moved the pin once, gently, then moved it back. The click landed in my blood as a small, decisive tooth. You are going to ask whether I think centuries were invented in that corridor, that entire epochs were minted from mischief. You will expect me to say something dramatic enough to drag the argument into the daylight, where defenders can shoot at it. But the truth has learned to be patient, because it has had to be. What I learned was not a single grand forgery, but 1,000 careful ones, each so minor it could be smiled away as clerical prudence. And yet the sum tilted the floor so slowly that people learned to stand at a slant without ever noticing their backs ached. The next room outward was darker, not because the lamp gave less, but because the surfaces gave nothing back. Maps lay on a trestle, their coastlines scribed with the arrogance of men who had not yet drowned. Margins bore corrections in an unhurried hand. A harbor scratched from a crescent to a straight, a road withdrawn like a promise. One map would have broken your heart. It broke mine. The eastern rim of a sea named, not with water's name, but with a saint's. The letters faded where a thumb had worried them for decades. In the lower corner, a red numeral, +4. 4 days had been added somewhere so that a ship could be recorded as arriving before it left, therefore belonging to mercy rather than to theft. Pinned above the maps was a small vellum square, a map of meaning rather than land. Lines connected words like quarries feeding a city, heretic connected to enemy of grain prices, miracle connected to experiment avoided, jubilee bound to pressure valve for unrest. Between calendar drift and election of, a double line like a scar, and at its center a dot the blade. A technician had drawn the sword not as a weapon but as a lever, the fulcrum under the ledger. You could move worlds with a lever if the fulcrum would bear. Across the hall, a narrow chamber peered at me like an untrusting eye. Its shelves held only containers, cylinders of tin and glass, each with a thread of hair, a flake of paint, a shaving of wood, a pinch of ash, a bead of wax, labeled with a place and a year. At first I thought relics, then I knew better. These were not holy. These were control samples. The ash of a burned charter from Cordoba, the wax that had sealed an unissued edict from Mainz, the hair from a monk who had copied the wrong date twice and then resigned to a hermitage where no one could ask him why. The room was an archive of evidence, and absence paired what had been done, and the tiny ingrown remnants of what could not be completely removed. At the back of the same chamber, a frame hung empty except for a web of threads taut as the strings of a small harp. Each thread had a knot marked with a year. When I stepped close, the air in my lamp's circle changed texture as if passing through a fine screen. If I plucked a thread, and I did, gently the knot vibrated, and the pluck came back to me as a date in a completely different hand, as if a document somewhere far away had revised itself to match the music. I stopped. I put both hands behind my back like a child in a room of porcelain. But I understood. The web made of time and touch allowed adjustments to travel, to harmonize distant ledgers, so that no archivist could later say, "But the numbers don't agree." The numbers would agree because the instrument had taught them to sing together. I returned to the corridor with a respect that felt like grief. On the left, a low door with hinges that remembered being oiled invited a stoop. The room beyond smelt strongly of iron, and something sweeter underneath, like roses pressed in an old book. Chains tethered volumes to a spine that ran along the table, not so much to prevent theft as to keep them from drifting. The first book opened itself when my shadow reached it, a superstition, surely. The lamp's heat, coaxing old binding, and offered a profile of a pope who existed without reigning, a placeholder in white, a hand with the power to countersign a vacuum. The entry for his reign, an evening and a dawn, was meticulous. 3 seals, 2 witnesses, 1 oath. The oath's wording was cautious to the point of cruelty. Enough verbs to walk backwards through any accusation. Enough nouns to anchor an authority that had no face. On the facing page, a small, neat excision, a rectangle cut with a knife too clean to be angry. The caption beneath acknowledged nothing and everything at once with a single word: transtulit, transferred. To where, to whom? The ledger did not say. Ledgers are polite to a fault. I have spoken as a scholar speaks, even if I am confessing as a penitent does. Forgive me. The room deserves a more bodily account. The deeper I went, the more the breath in the walls developed a rhythm that nudged my own. My ribs found the timing and learned not to argue. It is a relief to borrow breath from stone. Stone keeps a budget of oxygen more carefully than priests keep a budget of absolutions. When I reached the curve, where the corridor bent under the basilica's impossible geometry, the hymn that was not a hymn returned, not voices, never voices, but the collective memory of having once been sung to. That is what time sounds like, when it refuses to give you words. There was a chapel without altar, only a lectern and a slab. On the lectern lay the Chronicon Crucis, the Crusade Chronicle. Not a book as I had expected, but a concertina of wooden panels, each faced with parchment so thin it was surely skin. The panels opened along a hinge like a ribcage, and within the hinge, a groove the length of a blade. The groove was stained very faintly darker, as if oil and years had seeped from a thing that had slept there too long to be welcomed elsewhere. I slid my hand along the groove, and the skin on the back of my fingers rose like a field in wind. The groove ended in a small cup-shaped depression, a socket, a scabbard without a scabbard's courtesy. The panels read themselves slowly into me. Public legend first, a relic sword taken up by a nameless knight who, outside a walled city, faced a king accused of heresy. When the blade entered the king, the sky dimmed, and the stars appeared like a battlefield map. Late scribes had underlined this as poetic. Earlier hands had measured it in degrees. A marginal gloss in a different ink offered a ratio between the distance of 2 stars and the number of days shaved from a penitential season that same year. The connection was not pious. It was mechanical. Between the panels drifted narrow slips, inscribed with prayers nominally to God, functionally to procedure. Let the ledger balance. Let the interval serve. Let the faithful not notice. Amen. A drawer at the base of the lectern produced diagrams, the altar set for the oath, the blade laid exactly so, the candles measured not for beauty but for synchronization with a water clock, the oath-giver's hand to rest on the fuller where the characters clustered thickest, the response to be spoken by a witness without name. When the final line of the vow was uttered, a runner in a separate room would pull a rope that tipped a bowl whose draining water turned a gear that shifted a weight that depressed, a lever that pressed a plate, that aligned a stamp in a chancery across the city. an alignment so subtle and so late in the night that no clerk could swear he remembered making it. And yet, the seal on the edict in the morning would be true, because the pressure had found its place in the chain. The mechanics of forgetting had gears and counterweights. I felt my own teeth grind in sympathy. If you think this is fantasy, I tell you again, the most frightening conspiracies are not the extravagant ones that require palaces of actors. They are the small, durable devices that ask ordinary men to do ordinary tasks at moments where timing is the only sacrament that counts. A runner pulls a rope. A clerk stamps when told. A monk adjusts a margin by a thumb's width. A captain writes his watch slightly fast. And whole dynasties drift by inches until a harbor is not where the map remembers it, and a saint no longer has a day to claim him. On a narrow shelf beneath the lectern, a notebook waited whose handwriting resembled my own so closely I set my hand beside it to compare, the way a child sets his foot by his father's track in snow. The book kept a table column after column of minute cause and vast effect. Moved the first Sunday of Lent forward one day in Valencia to accommodate rain procession charter from noble house, acquires retroactive legitimacy, monastery land dispute resolved without appeal, physician expelled for naturalist, explanations does not translate text on fever's outbreak in port lasts 1 month longer than it would have. The far right column wore no ink but the impression of a pen pressed hard and never released. The pen had recorded what could not be decently written. Acceptable losses. I stood there until the oil thinly coated the glass of the lamp and the flame shrank to a bead. Night above or day, I could not tell. Below, time obeyed the ledger, not the sky. I whispered the motto, not out of loyalty, but as one tests a tooth for pain. Memoria regitur. What startled me was not the truth of it, but the method. They did not rule memory like tyrants, spectacular, clumsy, eager to be seen, or, not only so, they ruled it like accountants who smiled at grandchildren and sharpened pencils. The ledgers did not disapprove of curiosity. The ledgers simply learned to price it so that ordinary people could not afford to keep asking. Under the slab, in a cavity closed by a grating, lay a series of sealed files. Each contained a viscous shadow, black-brown like the syrup from poppies. Labels, numbered, corresponded to dates I recognized from the corridor's elastic span. 614, 741, 901. I twisted one file, and the liquid oozed toward the glass as if persuaded by breath. It was not blood, it was not ink. It was both ink made from blood, blood made into ink, passed through 100 texts so that a tincture of each revision could be retrieved and added to this syrup. A record of edits, a concentrate of absence. I put the file back as if it could be bruised. I went once more to the blade. It lay on its pedestal with a self-possession I have only ever seen in old men and certain animals. The words along the fuller played at the edge of comprehension, circling the camp of my mind but refusing entry. I did not try to lift it, though my hand hovered. You do not raise a thing that has been taught to lower centuries. I bowed ridiculous, perhaps, or necessary. The lamp's final inch of wick guttered, then steadied, and the breath in the walls matched mine again, the way an old friend will unconsciously match your step as you walk. You will say I am romanticizing stone. I ask that you stand once in a room where the only remaining honesty is architecture. Rooms can be truthful when books have been bribed. The way back up taught me another lesson. With every turn of the stair, I felt a lightness against my shoulder, a physical thing, then not physical, then both, that made me turn, made me put out my hand as if to guide a presence past a difficult step. It was not a person. It was the sense that the blade's hunger for vows had learned my shape and, in the humble way of tools, simply wanted to be used. I told it aloud, without voice at first, and then with a voice barely larger than breath, that I would not speak the oath. Something relaxed, something held its dignity. You can refuse with respect. It is important the blade learn this. If blades can learn, at the threshold I paused with palm on silver, listening for pursuit and expecting none. Conspiracies do not pursue. They wait for you to return and do their work for them in the name of caution. The plate cooled a little under my hand as if disappointed in softness and then allowed me out. The basilica above received me, like a ledger accepts an entry that will later be reclassified. It did not notice me more than necessary. Back at the desk, I wrote without cipher, on ordinary paper, in a polite hand that could pass any audit. I recorded none of what I have just told you. I wrote instead a note about a visiting scholar's request and the disposition of a donation of candles. The discipline of this lie steadied my wrist. Then, in the margin of a blank page tucked into the base of a drawer no one has opened in years, I wrote 3 lines. There is a corridor that behaves like a ledger. There are men who call themselves keepers of the balance, and their balances are not ours. There is a blade that trims not bodies but histories, and it has been honed on vows. I shut the drawer. I locked nothing. Locks are gestures. Gestures are good at pleasing the part of the mind that wants to believe the world can be made tidy with a click. I have learned what clicks do. In the hours that followed, hours measured above by lamps and below by a gear that never loses its nerve, I began the work that would become this tape. Not a protest, not an exposé. A confession with footnotes you must find yourself. You will not need my corridor. You will have your own. An attic with a box of letters whose dates contradict the family story. A museum label that only ever says School of where a name should be. A civic holiday that no one can explain the origin of because its origin would unmake the comfort it sponsors. Touch the plate. Some doors prefer a hand that does not insist on being right. Before I slept, if I slept, I sat again with the 3 provincial calendars and watched them breathe. In their small adjustments, 3 days for a bishop, 7 for a famine, 1 for a nameless guest, I recognized the large arithmetic of civilization, the way we will redesign constellations, rather than admit a ship arrives too late, the way we will push a feast forward, rather than name a drought what it is and feed the hungry as if they were us. The mathematics of mercy and convenience are cousins. The corridor had been built to insist they were the same. My work would be to separate them without turning mercy into a casualty. On my way from the submararium, I passed a novice in a corridor too clean to have ever hosted debate. He nodded and looked through me with the charitable blindness of youth. I envied him nothing and everything. I wanted for him a world where calendars keep faith with seasons and ledgers balance themselves by virtue of honesty instead of device. I wanted for him the right to ask why, out loud, and only be told to ask again. You will ask what I fear, not the keepers, not the blade, though it will ask me for my throat by name one day, and I will have to answer in a dialect I have not learned yet. I fear the fatigue that comes with patience, the way it invites a small surrender. Let this week remain misplaced. Let this name stay erased. Let this experiment wear the cloak of miracle a little longer, because everyone looks better in miracles. That is how the corridor widens. That is how ink grows obedient. I will try to be disobedient with care. When at last the bell above began the first of the day's iron hymns, I wrote the date in a firm hand today, as the world names it, and refused to add or subtract anything from it, even in imagination. I have seen the temptation that eats days the way sugar eats teeth. The Chronicle taught me what it could, and then it asked me a question. If memory is ruled, by whom will you choose to be ruled? By a blade? By a habit? By a calendar shaped to keep you from seeing your century's spillages? I answered with a line I will keep answering until I am out of breath. By witnesses. The descent will happen again. The corridor will teach again. The ledgers will try to be polite. The keepers will collect interest. But now you know there is a groove in the lectern, shaped to fit a sword that drinks light, a web of threads that hums dates into agreement, a map where heretic and grain prices cross like wires, a drawer of files filled with something thicker than history and thinner than blood. Knowing is not victory, it is breath. It is the choir of air inhaling before the first note. It is the invitation to the next step. If you doubt me, sleep now. Doubt is a muscle. It makes the next door easier to open. I return to the lectern as one returns to a wound to check if the bleeding has stopped, to see whether the edges have learned to hold hands. The concertina of panels rested open like a thorax that refuses a physician's stitch, ribs spread, heart breathing its dark arithmetic. I told myself I came for clarity, but clarity is often a mask we put on our dread. What I wanted was a method. What I found was a rite. The diagrams did not pretend to piety. They were draftsman's drawings, angles, measures, the sneer of precision. The altar was rendered in 3 views. A line bisected the slab with the indifference of geometry. Candles marked not devotion but duration. A small water clock squatted like a toad at the altar's foot, its trickle calibrated to a chant length, not because anyone needed timing to pray, but because the machine of forgetting requires a cadence, and cadences are safer to borrow than to invent. The blade's placement was specified to the finger's breadth. The hand of the oath-giver was to rest upon the fuller where the characters were densest, the way one might press a seal so that wax and intent fuse. The oath itself was copied in several hands, each half erased by a later hand that improved the grammar of evasion. Its first line professed reverence, its second enrolled reverence as labor, its third, let the interval serve, let the record conform, let the faithful not notice. I repeated it softly, and the lamp wavered as if a draught had found us, though no door moved. A marginal note in a crabbed italic directed the witness to speak the response on the 4th beat of the vow-giver's breath. It was choreography more than liturgy. I could see the room now, a priest with a voice trained to disappear, a clerk off stage, in a chancery across town waiting for a bell that would never ring, and yet it would be as if it had rung. A runner with rope-burnt palms crouched by a valve, a watchman setting his hourglass a finger's width fast, an astronomer making a notation in his star table a day too early with a shrug he would not remember the next morning. Each trivial obedience, a tooth in the gear, each tooth turning so slowly the world mistook it for stillness. Between the panels someone had tucked slips of parchment, prayers in the ordinary sense that had been purposed into gaskets, soft, compressible, designed to absorb the dangerous edges of intention. "Lord, keep us in your times," one read in a careful round hand. But "your" had been scraped and overwritten with "our," so neatly that only the glisten of abrasion betrayed the theft. Another said, "Let what is late be as if it were early," a petition that translates easily into the language of docks and debts. I held the slips and felt the pulse of the water clock, or of my own blood pretending to belong to it. I am not immune to the seductions of order. There is a sweetness in making messy events align, in adjusting the world to a more coherent sentence. My whole life had been spent coaxing syntax from heaps of paper, teaching ink to sit and stay. The rite offered a confectioner's perfection. Shave this, add that, and the calendar would hold its shape under heat. But on a separate panel, one that smelled faintly of smoke, figures marched down the page in a column of costs. 3 market days, rain-dexed price rebellion diffused. Feast shifted to avoid eclipse. Physician's treatise delayed in copying. Duke's illegitimate heir, legitimated by Dawn Monastery, loses contested orchard in perpetuity. Siege recorded as concluded on Sunday dead. Buried without proper lists, names omitted from rolls. The ledger of forgetting does not forget to count. That is what makes it the more terrible. Opposite these costs, the phrase along the blade's fuller acquired the courage to translate another inch. You may rule memory, but you will never own it. The sentence came into me like a hook, without a barb, sliding smooth, holding without tearing. Ownership is a boast, ruling is a habit. The distinction mattered more here than theology ever had above ground. You rule by making choices feel inevitable. You own by convincing yourself the choices were yours. The rite did both, and called it devotion. I tried to imagine the first time it was done. You don't invent a machine like this without a first occasion. A famine with the wrong saints nearby to blame. A coronation that arrived without a day to receive it. A war announced prematurely that needed retroactive obedience from the calendar. See a room lit by the kind of caution that becomes cruelty. The caution of men who believe that the world must be held steady even if their hands shake. The first oath-giver might have been kind. Kindness calcifies quickly when it meets institution. He would have believed that one nudge could spare a province. He would have believed that nudges do not add up. A drawer beneath the lectern yielded a whetstone the size and shape of a psalter. One face was plain. The other was incised with characters, not unlike those along the fuller, except these had been rounded by touch. People had sharpened their faith here. One could lay in a stroke along the stone and feel the vowel shapes become smoother in the mouth. The consonants find their edges as if the language itself had a blade to keep keen. The stone smelled of metal and oil and old breath. I had the absurd thought that you could sharpen your vow against it until your vow could cut anything. I looked for blood in the rite and did not find it. The sacrifice here was ink. Blood belongs to bodies, and bodies complicate ledgers. Ink belongs to records, and records can be disciplined. The rite's cruelty lay in its choice of victim. Not dissidents or enemies, not even ideas, but intervals for which there is no mourning. Who laments a fortnight? Who carries flowers to the grave of a moved feast? Who writes a letter to the editor on behalf of a century that has been asked to step 2 inches to the left? That is why the rite worked. It expected no riot from the dead it made. On the far panel, A small illumination hid in a flush of gold leaf. A hand holding a pen, seen from above, the way angels sometimes look down at popes in pictures. The pen was drawing a circle around a date, and the circle was not complete. The caption in minuscule read, "The mercy of margins." I felt heat at my neck, the prickle that comes when someone names your sin in a casual voice. How many times had I used the margin to rescue an uncooperative text? How many times had I bracketed a thorn to make the page smoother under the eye? The right was the margin, expanded to the scale of centuries. Do not think there were no prayers here that stung with sincerity. One parchment was stained with something more like tears than like water. The writer had begged for a change that would keep a distant garrison from freezing by moving a feast early enough for wagons to be blessed before the pass iced over. If the rite was used that night, the blessing came. If it came, some men lived. I will not lie to you. My heart made room for that case, and room is dangerous. Compassion is the citadel that falls first when the machine knocks. I closed my eyes and imagined the procession. Midnight without the comfort of stars. The altar draped in linen that had learned to keep secrets. The water clock swallowing seconds with patient mouth. The blade drinking lamp glow and returning nothing. The oath-giver's palm. Finding the fuller the way. A drowning man finds the smoothness of his own death. A clerk across the city, aligning a stamp with a wobble of his wrist that tomorrow he will insist was a trick of the light. A watchman half dozing, waking when the bell that is not a bell breathes, turning his hourglass so sand begins anew a little earlier than sand should begin. A chain of actions fragile as the intestine of a sparrow, and yet strong enough to shift, a month by half a minute, a year by a day, a rumor into a law. On a shelf behind the lectern, in a slipcase soft with use, a small book kept a litany of erasures. Not entries of what had been cut, that would have been too honest, but of what no longer needed to be checked because it no longer existed. Herbarium of Sister C, Sorbonne unnecessary, letter of Queen E, to certain astronomers irrelevant, Chronicle of the Lesser Crusade apocryphal, map of the Northern Gulf featuring unverified harbor spurious. The verbs were indifferent the way frost is indifferent. Firm, clean, consistent. My throat closed. It is one thing to destroy. It is another to convince a shelf that nothing was there to be destroyed. At some unmarked minute, the words along the fuller leaned again, like a friend who has been patient with your obtuseness and now risks candor. You may rule memory, but you will never own it. You may price it, you may prune it, you may demand a receipt for every question, but you will never own it. Own suggests a stable possession. Memory lives conditionally in breath, in telling, in the rehearsal of wonder. To own it would be to still it. Even these men, with their levers and clocks, could not still it. They could only pinch it into shapes that served their ledgers. I pressed my hand to the groove where the blade had slept. The wood beneath had grown dense with oils, like old skin that has learned to forgive too much. The groove ended in that little cup where the point would rest. I could see the ceremony's final motion now. The blade lifted, the vow completed, the point eased into its home, the machine exhaling elsewhere, ink thinning, dates persuading themselves to move. I wanted to be sick where I stood, not from disgust but from recognition. How many times had I spoken a vow so neatly that it changed nothing I could be blamed for, and everything someone else would have to live with? That is the genius of the rite. It disperses culpability across so many hands that no one hand feels dirty enough to wash. When I stepped back, the water in the clock gave a small hiccup in the throat of the tube. The flame quivered. A draft brushed my knuckles. I am not a man to talk of ghosts. Ghosts are a genre that obey inventories of its own. But the air had the attitude of a presence resigned to being unseen. I'm here, I said, not to summon, not to invite, but to assure, the way you tell a child under a bed that you are not leaving the room. The presence did not change its posture. The room is strong-willed. It does not perform. I wanted to test the right to see if the world would really consent to being trimmed in my hearing. A scientist would have. I am a coward with complicated ethics. Instead, I set myself a smaller cruelty. The ledgers listed an experimenter, a physician whose treatise on fevers had been delayed by the clerical drift of a penitential season. Because of the delay, a translation did not arrive in a port until heat had already settled in the alleys. Because it did not arrive, certain measures were taken late. Because they were taken late, children died, whose names would have been anonymous, even if they had lived. I opened my mouth to censure the right aloud. What came out was not censure, but a more damning tenderness. They did it to keep the harvest festivals from losing their place, I said, trying the words on like a borrowed coat. The room did not accept the excuse. I could feel it wait. No, I said. They did it because the ledger never asks for funerals. The lamp colored the answers with no color at all. On the reverse of one panel, hidden until I tilted the wood, someone with a quieter hand had scratched a catechism in the kind of Latin you only learn in childhood. Quis custodit memoriam? Who keeps memory? The answer below was not the classical joke. No custodes answered by other custodes. The reply, in a line so thin I had to lean as if listening, qui testantur, those who witness. It made an unadorned sense. You cannot trim what someone is holding with both hands. You can cut the finger, you can cut the hand, but you cannot pretend the object never was if their body remembers lifting it. I let my breath lengthen until the room and I shared a diaphragm. Then, coward with complicated ethics that I am, I performed a rite of my own. I read the procession of adjustments back to front, the clerk's stamp unpressed, the watchman's glass unturned, the runner's rope unpulled, the vow unsaid, the candles unlit, the blade unlaid. As I did, I spoke the names that had been turned into inventory, the physician whose experiment had been outfitted in Miracle's junk clothes, the painter whose signature had been laundered to school of, the queen whose letters grew modest to the point of silence. I lifted them the way you lift a box too heavy to name. The room did not change, neither did I. But fatigue removed its mask. Underneath it, I found a kind of stubbornness that could serve as piety when piety is not available. When I finally looked up, the chamber recognized me, the way a patient recognizes an incurable condition, not with welcome, not with hostility, but with an agreement to coexist in the time left. I closed the panels one by one, reversing ribs into chest, chest into silence. The hinge sighed. The groove remained the groove it had been. I wrapped the whetstone in a cloth and put it back. I replaced the prayers, leaving one, the late be early, face up as an indictment I could live with. A little ugly truth to sand the edge of any future pretty lie. On my way out, the narrow chamber of samples drew me again, as ugly rooms do. The web strung across the empty frame waited, its knots small as seeds. I touched a thread, not plucked, just laid a finger along it, and every knot hummed at once in a vibration too fine for hearing and too certain to be called chance. It was an instrument that could be played, and was being played by hands other than mine. I took my finger back, as if from a flame. There is a music of registrars. It has no melody. It does not need one. In the corridor of dates I chose a year that had grown elastic under my hand before 741 and held it lightly. The wood pulsed once, twice, like a throat swallowing. "No," I said aloud, and the pulse steadied to the pace of my wrist. Refusal has to be spoken. Thought alone is too cheap a currency for corridors that handle centuries in cash. The pulse kept time with me until I let go. I understood then that the right strength depended on absence of witness, on the world accepting that intervals do not impose duties. If enough eyes weighed a week, the week would resist adjustment, not by miracle, but by the simple physics of attention. At the stair I glimpsed, not in sight, but in the way sight anticipates shape, the blade where it lay on its oak. It did not call. It waited, the way tools wait, innocent and eager for use. I had the urge to apologize to it, to the men who had made it, to the awkwardness of being a person who could not promise to behave. "You were made for an altar," I said in a voice that had learned the tenderness you reserve for a tired animal. "I was made for a ledger and forgot to be ashamed. Now I am learning to be something else." The stone under my hand warmed to my temperature, and then a degree more, as if the plate chose to memorize me again. Above, the basilica pretended not to notice the subtraction below. It does this with aplomb. Pretend long enough, and pretense looks like marble. I sat at my table and drew a line through a sentence that did not need a line through it, just to monitor the way my hand loved the act. I made tea, which tasted of metal and memory. I slept without knowing when sleep had begun, dreaming of candles measured by ladles and saints who learned to move their feast days like furniture between rooms. In the dream, a child asked me where the year had gone, and I pointed to a web strung across an empty frame. The child did not cry. Children accept instruments. It is adults who grieve them. When I woke, an unearned clarity had settled in me like dust. I could see the rite as both temptation and scaffolding, as a way of holding things up while men dragged a stone into place, and as a way to justify never taking the scaffolding down. All scaffolds make handsome silhouettes against the sky. Men confuse them with buildings. I wrote this: "The rite lowers the price of convenience by charging interest to memory." And then I wrote, "Do not pay on time." I took from a drawer a thin roll of paper and began copying the oath not to use, not to send, but the way you copy an enemy's signature so you will never be fooled by a forgery. Line for line, pause for beat, the fourth breath for the witness, the amen for the water clock. At the end, I added my own clause, a parasite intelligible only to me. Let the witness be an assembly, and let the assembly be uncounted. If a rite requires a single witness to keep its symmetry, I would give it a crowd. The ledger hates crowds. Crowds write in long, illegible hands no stamp can align. You will ask me here, perhaps wearily, perhaps with the generosity of someone drowsing toward sleep, whether the blade was truly cursed. Cursed implies an intent in the instrument, an appetite that eats regardless of the hand that feeds. I do not give it that power. The curse belongs to the habit we have of building a law around an emergency and then applying it to peace. We take a lever meant to lift a fallen wall and use it to pry open the world, as if it were a chest we were owed. The blade was consecrated, yes. It was given a job description. The curse is how quickly men come to love job descriptions, because they relieve them of having to improvise mercy. If I could place a sign over the lectern where the chronicle rests, it would not say, "Beware." It would say, "This mechanism has no conscience. Bring your own." And if I could place one over the stair, it would say, "Intervals are people in disguise. We do not see them, but we step on them, and they bear us, and when we move them without asking, they bruise." I folded the copied oath into an envelope addressed to no one and placed it in a book on a shelf. No visitor asks to see a devotional with a spine too tight to open comfortably. That is where such things belong, until the person who needs them learns to look where comfort is not. Then I returned to the desk and wrote what anyone reading me later would call an ordinary report. It contained nothing treasonous, nothing brave. Beneath it, I wrote in the tiniest hand a sentence almost no one would find. "You may rule memory. You will never own it." That is a prayer I can say without guilt. Before I ended that day's work, I went once more to the corridor to stand before the date 12:04. The wood there felt slick, as if too many fingers had asked it to mean too many things. "No," I said again, more gently than before. "Refusal must learn courtesy, or it becomes another species of rule." The corridor's pulse matched my wrist one last time and then receded, as if a tide I could not see had obeyed a moon I could not name. I climbed. The plate released me. If this confession bores you in places with its measurements and its cogs, forgive me. Stories about machines must be as long as machines are, or else you will wake tomorrow and wonder why the hour is wrong and the feast moved and the harbor missing, and no one will be able to show you the tooth that turned. The Chronicle taught me the teeth. The blade offered me an oath. I am offering you a counter-ritual. Breathe, witness, call intervals by their names, and never confuse scaffolding for a cathedral. They were never numerous. The ones who matter never are. Crowds are for processions and riots. Mechanisms prefer a few quiet hands. You could spend a lifetime above ground inventing orders to blame inventories of Jesuits and Rosicrucians, Benedictines with strange hobbies, scholars who sign their letters with mythological initials, and you would not be wrong exactly, only over-satisfied. Names are coats. They are put on for the weather and taken off when the season changes. The men I met below did not love coats. They loved ledgers. When I say I met them, I mean the way one meets a storm, by seeing what it has done and what it intends, by feeling its pressure change in your bones long before the rain begins. Their official name presented itself with a conservator's fussiness. Custodes aequarii, keepers of the balance, and at first I wanted to laugh at the plainness of it. Men who could move feasts and harvests and grief by a finger width, who could stretch an episcopate to cover a necessary forgery, and compress a reign to permit a necessary omission, and they named themselves after bookkeeping. But balance is not bookkeeping in their mouth. It is a theology of tolerable distortions. Balance, as they mean it, is not fairness, it is settlement. The world must settle, and if that requires the ledger to acquire a piety, they will pray with pencils. If you have not noticed them before, it is because noticing is expensive. They know how to price your attention until you save it for later. They are patient with your suspicion. They have taught themselves to be misread as someone else's problem and not my field. They can be Jesuits when a Jesuit is useful, Rosicrucians when a rose and a cross earn a door, secular when a monk would be arrested, pious when a bureaucrat would be ignored. They do not much care for the metaphysics attached to their masks. They care for throughput, the reliable movement of intervals from the margin into the sum. I learned their methods by reading the scuffs on the floor and the glosses in the margins where a clerk's pen had grown anxious, and then calmed marks that suggest a man reminded himself he was only a hinge, never a door. Their recruitment must be slow and thorough. They have no appetite for zealots. Zeal burns bright and smells too much like smoke. They want technicians, men who can keep a secret without feeling heroic, who can edit a page without leaving fingerprints. The best candidates are born in families where order equals kindness, where a father straightens a picture frame when grief enters the room. Upstairs, at lunch, you would not notice them. Their mouths are modest. They look at food the way copyists look at vellum, pleased that it has arrived, determined to mar none of it with clumsiness. One sat beside me a dozen times without revealing his edge. He asked for salt and meant silence. I offered the shaker and understood my consent. He spoke Greek softly, as if the language were a cat that could be startled. He laughed at nothing and smiled at everything. Once, when a novice dropped a stack of breviaries and apologized to the room, this man lifted his hand in a gesture like a benediction, and the boy calmed instantly. It was skill, not grace. He had learned how to cut panic out of the air with a gesture, the way the blade trims annotations out of a chronicle. Their training begins in places where time runs slower than above. Barns repurposed into archives, mountain seminaries where fog covers the ugliness of shortcuts, chancery back rooms where stamps and spoons share drawers. They are taught to copy a text so that it is more itself after their hand than before. They are taught, too, to be bored without rage. Boredom is a sacrament in their church. A bored man can endure the small work that shifts an age by half a minute. They practice the choreography of the oath with sticks instead of steel, water instead of ink, calendars written in chalk and erased with the flat of a hand. One lesson, recorded in a notebook that stank faintly of sulfur, asked the student to correct the date of a letter on a wooden tablet while answering kindly a child's question in the next room. The point was divided attention without guilt. If compassion learned the schedule, the mechanism would never jam. Inquisitions, those stages of brutality furnished for posterity, are useful to them only as theater. Terror distracts, yes, but it also draws eyes that were happily elsewhere. The custodies prefer a quiet education. They fund schools that grade curiosity as if it were a subject one passes or fails. A child who asks, "Why is praised for form and docked for endurance?" His questions are accelerated into the place where questions are so constant they become static. This is how you train a population to confuse inquiry with noise. Later, if that child grows into a scholar, he will congratulate himself for having learned how to be quiet. He will discover the satisfying fatigue of a day spent polishing the same sentence until it no longer offends anyone. He will call it craft. He will be useful. One afternoon, late and unmarked, I found a room of notebooks. Each belonged to an apprentice of the balance, each an exercise in humility. On the first pages they wrote their names in full, with a flourish not unlike a pirate's. By the middle the flourishes shrank into the spine. By the last page the names were initials. In some, the initials were erased. On the back cover, an oath. I consent to be the margin. I closed one and it sighed as if let out of a tight shoe. I wanted to write my own name there and leave it, like a decoy of guilt, as if I could satisfy the mechanism by confessing to its ambitions. You will ask, did they believe? Men who labor so neatly rarely confess to belief in anything but the labor itself, and yet the ones who last beyond the apprenticeship acquire a creed that could be mistaken for mercy by the right listener. They say, the world shakes, people fall when the calendar slips, bread fails when dates argue. If we must shave a day to keep a city steady, who would condemn us? They point to a winter when a feast was moved to save a garrison's toes, and the toes saved men, and those men later fathered children who sang psalms. They do not point to the physician whose experiments were repriced as miracles, so that the miracle could fail to arrive on time. They do not deny him, either. They bring him tea in the imagination and call it balance. In their archives, among the ledgers that lay with the undisturbed dignity of gravestones, there were shelves of teaching apparatus, hourglasses whose throats had been narrowed by a hair's width, water clocks with a slightly tilted lip, bells connected to bellows so that ringing could come as an exhalation no ear would confess to hearing. There was a tin model of a city with little pins for chancery and watchpost, altar and astronomer's window. A thread connected them and could be plucked to demonstrate how a pressure on the vow would reach the stamp across town. The model sat beneath a child's diagram of a solar system, where all the planets wore names like utterance and witness and interval, round and indifferent. You could teach anyone with toys like these. The cruel part is that you could teach yourself. I tried once to map their hierarchy. Maps are a librarian's superstition. We believe that the shape of power will make power less personal. It will not. At the top there is not a man you can stab or a woman you can persuade. There is an appetite lodged in a habit. There are 3 or 5 or 7 elders who remember how famine smells and have sworn to keep that smell out of their grandchildren's clothes, even if it costs the grandchildren the truth. Beneath them, men who enjoy repairs more than improvements. Beneath them, the technicians who gather the daily errors and massage them into usefulness. Beneath them, men who think they are only doing their jobs. At the bottom, a knock on a clerk's door at midnight, instructing him to align a stamp. A scene from their catechism returns to me as if it were mine. A pupil standing at an astrolabe that has been altered to measure opinions. The instructor adjusts a small weight, and the pupil says, "But that is not the sky." The instructor answers, "We are not measuring the sky. We are measuring the city's ability to bear it." He is not lying. He is moving the standard of virtue from accuracy to endurance. There is a world in which this is kindness. There is a world in which it is cowardice. We live in both. They are not without poets. A thin notebook, its paper scalloped by damp, held 4 lines written in a hand that tried too hard to be careless. When days go hungry, we feed them hours. When saints grow weary, we lend them names. When men lose footing, we flatten calendars. When truth is late, we swear it came. A man who can write that is not an idiot. He is seduced. He thinks he is the valet of history, straightening the collar on an unruly gentleman before dinner. He does not realize he has learned to prefer the gentleman tidy to the gentleman honest. Valleys become masters by choosing clothing over skin. I asked once, not aloud, "You understand, but in the grammar of a glance that refuses to be domesticated, how they select their saints to erase and their sinners to elevate?" The answer, written in the negative space between two ledgers, infuriated me with its competence. They do not evaluate holiness, they evaluate utility. A saint whose cult threatens to redistribute attention toward the wrong questions is shelved with care. A sinner whose fame can be re-aimed toward docility is given room. They love the middle of things. Middling virtue, middling vice, middling stories that end where dinner begins. Extremes require margin notes. Middle requires none. Fear is their catechism, not the loud fear of racks and flames, which bellows for witnesses. Their fear is the velvet kind put in a child's pocket. Early fear of being foolish, fear of asking the wrong man the right question, fear of speaking too loud in a room designed for whispering. Silence was never sacred. It was enforced. But the enforcement seldom needs to declare itself. It is installed, like a polite staircase that leads nowhere anyone has the stamina to climb. You might wonder whether they ever failed. Mechanisms break. Even the sea loses patience with a coast and drowns it honestly. Yes, they fail more often than a proud world would guess, but their failures are assimilated into the proof of concept. If a date slips and causes embarrassment, the embarrassment is distilled and bottled as a lesson in why better lubrication is needed. If a saint refuses erasure because the poor loved him with a love that kept market days from tipping, the saint is rebranded as a stern uncle and set to watch the door of a college. If a queen's letter returns from annihilation with a stain shaped like a harbor, the stain is named forgery and the harbor tradition until ships forget they ever docked there. In a drawer marked only with a stroke of red, I found memoranda from bishops and magistrates and guildmasters who had been offered adjustments and declined them. The letters were surprising for their lack of outrage. "We will let the feast fall where it falls," one wrote in a slanted, honest hand. "If the harvest fails, we will eat air." Another, "Leave us the week as it is. Let the Duke's legitimacy stand on his mother's sighs, not on a joyous Sunday retrospectively imposed." Those names did not prosper. They did not die badly, but their towns learned slowly that generosity is expensive without subsidy. The letters were preserved like pressed leaves from a plant the gardeners had decided not to allow. Even engineers keep souvenirs of what they cannot admire openly. Among the souvenirs was a child's primer, printed poorly in a town press with cheap ink so that the letters wore little halos from their own ill discipline. The alphabet had been revised here and there. A for altar remained, B for bread likewise, but Q for quaerere to ask had been replaced with Q for quiet. The illustration showed a boy at a desk with his hands folded on a book as a teacher's shadow fell across the page. The artist, bless him, had included a tiny rebellion. The boy's left thumb was lifting the corner of the page. The shadow did not see. The custodies did, I promise you. The primer was reprinted the next year with the thumb obedient. The boy's hand was taught to be whole. I promise details because I am tired of the world's fondness for sweeping indictments that save us from looking at hinges. Forgetting is engineered with pins. A woman sat in a small room with a bowl of water and poured it through a narrow channel until the men in the next room could time a response to a vow. She taught her daughter to keep steady when men asked questions. The daughter married a man who stamped without being told. That is how you build an altar that reaches a chancery window without touching anything between. Brilliance is not required. Care is. Care, misaimed, becomes cruelty so refined it passes for good manners. You want a face, I know, a villain to hiss at. I will give you instead a pair of hands. They belong to the man who asked me for salt and meant silence. They are clean but not ashamed of work. The nails are trimmed carefully, not with vanity but to keep ink from dying under their crescent. On the third finger of the right hand, there is a callus where pens rest. On the pad of the thumb, a stain that never quite leaves. He holds his fork with the same economy with which he holds a stylus. When he folds his hands, the fingers make a cathedral no worshipper could be turned from. He is good at listening. He is better at listening for what will not be said. If you cry in front of him, he will find a cloth and offer it, not to comfort you, but to prevent the tears from blotting the paper he will later need to read. If you laugh, he will smile, and the smile will take one notch from your attention without you missing it. If the silver plate remembers his palm, the stones grow courteous and move aside. He has never spoken the oath aloud. He has never needed to. Habit said it on his behalf, and the mechanism learned his cadence. Do they sleep well? In the drawer with the primer I found a rosary where the beads had been replaced with tiny abachi squares wired with 5 stones each. The crucifix at the end was ordinary, worn, kissed. Men who replace beads with sums do sleep. They count backwards from God to 0 and then forward again to balance. They wake with the satisfaction of an equation that behaved. If they dream, they do not tell anyone who writes down dreams. A disagreement among them sat like a bruise between 2 folios. One elder argued that the right should be used sparingly and named afterward as a penance. Another replied that penances destroy morale and that the machine's success required confidence. A third, older than both, wrote simply, "The blade does not know shame." Underneath, a different hand added, "Teach it." That second hand was careful, upright, precise. I recognized it later, though I will not say where, because names are not what we are trading here. What matters is that there is a heresy among even the engineers, the belief that instruments can be civilized. They cannot. Instruments are domesticated only by the refusal of those who would otherwise use them. You cannot make a lever ethical by engraving scripture on it. You can only choose not to pry. A story, then, because you asked for a documentary and I must respect the genre. There was a famine in a valley where men had grown stubborn about the patron they would allow into their barns. The custodes offered to move a feast to align a blessing with the arrival of grain from the coast. The valley declined. The grain rotted in carts. Men died. Years later, their children cheered a magistrate who promised a more flexible calendar. The mechanism does not need gratitude. It needs incidents. Do you call this a confession or an apology? Neither. It is a witness report. The valley could have eaten if a week had been shuffled like cards. The price would have been a habit that never afterwards met a schedule it didn't feel entitled to correct. I do not tell you which choice was holy. I confess that both were human. Because I am not a journalist, I will give you something. Journalists cannot keep without editors turning it into ornament. A silence. In one room of their school, the walls were padded not with fabric but with pages of music theory. Rests, pauses, fermatas like little sunsets over notes. The pupils sat and learned to hold their breath through a bar that was not theirs, to come in on a beat a hair before the conductor's hand, to lay a note where the room would not expect it, and call the surprise inevitability. This is how intervals become plastic. Teach a body to miss time with intelligence, and it will never plead innocence again. Intelligence becomes the alibi rather than the protest. Fear, I said, is their catechism. Education is their liturgy. Habit is their relic. What then is their sacrament? Receipt. Not the slip of paper that proves an exchange occurred, but the metaphysical relief that follows a ritual of balancing. Men who can say, "It came out even," will forgive themselves anything. On a shelf of chalices and censers, tucked with no irony among vessels men have bled into, sat a small box of copper plates, printer's blocks for receipts. Received from the faithful, obedience. Paid to the faithful, peace. Underneath, a plate worn smooth from overuse. Adjusted, time. I kept my hands off those plates. To touch them would have been to admit that their sums could tempt my own. Before I left the room where their toys and tools and poems lay arranged, I permitted myself one act of vandalism so small it may be mistaken for clumsiness. On the child's primer illustration, the reprint, with the obedient thumb, I blew on the ink. It was long dry, decades dead, immune to breath. Still, I leaned for the shape of disobedience, the memory of moisture. It did nothing to the page. It did something to me. I remembered the earlier edition, and the thumb lifting the corner with a conspirator's hope. I chose to remember it harder. That is how I practice my right now. Intentional, petty remembering. On the corridor back to the stair, a shadow moved not with the lamp, but before it, as if the air itself wished to rehearse my ascent. I stopped, and the shadow stopped. "I will not give you my oath," I said, as I had said to the blade, but to something more general, to the appetite that asks for consent and pretends that consent is the last mercy we can afford. The shadow hesitated, then neither advanced nor retreated. A gentleman's disagreement. It is possible to be polite to your jailer without accepting the cell. This chapter should end with a mask torn off, a name spoken, a lever snapped. I have none to offer you. What I have instead are instructions, learned among men who believe that kindness means keeping the clock steady, even if the time is wrong. Do not mistake tidiness for truth. Do not let boredom polish you into obedience. Do not allow balance to pickpocket your hunger for accuracy. When a child in a picture tries to lift a page, help him. When a saint loses his day, light a candle on the wrong evening and tell your neighbors why. When a clerk knocks at midnight, offer tea and ask to see his stamp, and if he blushes, watch the hourglass until the sand stays honest. I return to the sub-basement between breaths and obligations. The men of the balance remain courteous. They always were. Courteous conspiracies are the most difficult to refuse. They do not bruise your shins when you walk away. They merely remind you that the stairs are long and your lungs are not what they were. I climb anyway. The silver remembers my hand and grows warmer than metal has a right to be. The basilica above practices the old trick of looking like God. I practice the newer trick of looking like a man who will not trade a week for a tidy ledger. You ask if I am afraid. I am, but not of them. I fear my own willingness to understand. The way understanding weakens condemnation, the way condemnation must sometimes be weak if we are to remain accurate about the creatures we are. They are not monsters. They are mechanics of mercy corrupted by success. This is their tragedy. They will be buried with receipts, and someone will balance them. I will bring no plate to their altar, only a breath held one beat longer than the room prefers. It is a small protest. Small protests cause the metronome to blink. If enough blink at once, the choir remembers it has lungs. I have reached the part of the confession where rhetoric threatens to outsing witness. Before I dismiss class, one last hinge for you to carry in a pocket where your money does not chafe it. The motto they hammered into silver above a door that never imagined opening for me, Memoria Regitur. Memory is ruled. The custodes equarii spend their years making that sentence true enough to rest their heads on. My answer is too simple to satisfy them, and too stubborn to be edited out. Memoria testatur. Memory bears witness. Rulers come and go. Witnesses keep showing up with candles and questions. That is the only arithmetic I will leave you with tonight. Breathe to its beat. Refuse receipts that balance what should remain unsettled. Carry your thumb against the page as if it weighs something. It does. I came back without announcing myself to my pulse. The muscles in my calves remembered the stare. The silver plate remembered my hand. Rooms remember more dependably than men do. I let the door close with the politeness of stone and gave the corridor permission to count me again. It did, reluctantly, as if arithmetic had learned the limits of its jurisdiction. The lectern waited with its ribs folded open, the groove like a healed incision that could be persuaded to ache. The water clock, which had no business still having water, spoke in small, regular vowels. I did not light another candle. Darkness is honest when asked a direct question. I laid my palm on the first panel and read the chronicle forward until the names thinned to initials and the initials to pronouns and the pronouns to the passive voice, where responsibility goes to winter and does not return. Then I read backward, and the grammar learned to stand without crutches. Places remembered their rivers. Rivers remembered their beds. A harbor sketched itself back into the crescent the map had straightened. A painter's signature refused to be school of, and wrote itself in the ordinary hand men use when they expect to be paid with bread. I turned pages the way a surgeon unspools gauze from a wound that has decided it will no longer impersonate health. The chronicle breathed, not metaphor breath, that little swell you feel beneath your fingertips when vellum gives up a lie it was trained to preserve. At Anno 1204, the parchment sighed, as if a chest loosened under a loosened strap. At Anno 1582, the margins crackled. The Gregorian vertebrae shifted, as when a back learns a better posture after years of carrying the wrong load. The corridor's ash planks tremored lightly, as if remembering what rings are for. I knew the trick by then, and naming it did not make it less frightening. The blade trims what is unwitnessed. The oath assumes the room is empty of more than furniture. If someone stands there and says the names aloud, the edge dulls against breath. The keepers had called witnesses to reinforce precision. I called them to injure inevitability. A witness is a kind of consecration. You do not need oil. You need attention that won't sit down when told. So I performed a poor man's rite, impoverished, not in courage, but in tools. I placed the provincial calendars, Apulia, Burgundy, Thrace, so their warm edges touched. I set the false harbor map with its correction straight where the curve belonged. I pulled from the narrow chamber the threadweb that hummed dates into agreement and leaned it, still strung, against the lectern's side so the knots could see what they'd been made to sing. Then I took a stub of pencil from my pocket, the sort that writes like an old man walks, and wrote nothing on a blank slip. I held it up as if it were scripture and read it aloud anyway, because reading is breath with duties. Let what was called late be exactly as late as it was, I said. Let what was named early admit its haste. Let the unpaid painters eat. The room did not applaud. It accepted the premise that a sentence can be a weight. I spoke the erased saints. Names no calendar sells you anymore because a saint who bothers the balance gets repossessed. I named the physician and the fever with the plainness of men who refuse to dramatize children. I named the queen whose letters were cross-hatched with denials until the paper looked woven. I named a list of anonymously buried dead from a Sunday war that had needed Sunday to be plausible, but had no use for names. I did not ask the room to return them. I asked it to stop assisting their absence. The lamp flame steadied, as if relieved to take a breath on my behalf. It leaned toward the fuller's script, which had circled my skull for days without landing. Another inch of meaning consented to be understood. Witness is weight. It came thin, as if the language itself had been made to lose iron, but it held. I repeated it the way you repeat a prescription to the pharmacist, to be sure you'll be forgiven when you get it wrong. Witness is weight. I placed the words where the water clock could hear them. The water clock, who has never forgiven men for wanting precision more than truth, ticked as if it could be comforted. A panel that had been reluctant to share its costs earlier found its confidence. It confessed without the flourish of shame. I copied with my poor pencil in a hand the ledger would struggle to recognize. Weak borrowed to authenticate land. Grant River. Diverted floodplain mercados diminish inland prices. Rise city's attention sold to the highest bidder for truce. The margin's thin vein of red, the keeper's sacred pigment, resisted taking the lead's dull shine. I pressed harder. The paper warmed. A machine that can be warmed can be unspooled. I read the oath backward, which is more dangerous than reading it forward. Rituals are designed to resist reversal. They covet the ambiguity that comes when you walk against a crowd. The first line, when braided backward, lost its reverence and kept only its labor. The second line, reversed, swallowed its verbs and left its nouns naked and shy. The third line, the line that always filleted me, broke into a kind of stutter that made it pitiful. Notice not faithful, the let. I let the stutter stand. Pity can be a solvent more honest than outrage. The blade lay on its oak, listening with the politeness of instruments. I did not touch it. I am not brave. I am exacting. Somewhere in the longer bones of the building, a bell rehearsed itself half a beat early, as if the lesson from the custody's padded music room had escaped its leash. The sound reached us thinner than usual, but present. The web's 1,000 knots trembled toward agreement. No, I said to the web, out loud, because refusal is a craft. I touched one knot with the softness you save for breaking a child's fever and held it still. The tremor calmed in that thread, then in its neighbor, as the physics of courtesy propagated. A web can be taught manners. The trick is to model them until imitation takes. You want wonders. You want the ceiling to bloom stars or the blade to take fire. You want a quantifiable miracle so your doubt can either retreat with honor or die theatrically. The room is too old for theater. What happened instead were adjustments so honest they looked like nothing happening at all. The invisible breath that had played choir for centuries found a pitch that would let tired lungs sing along. The ash planks took my pulse and kept it as tempo, not to dominate me, but to avoid humiliating me with a faster song than men can carry. Then the visions came, not a pageant, not an ecstasy, not a demand for believers. Just the kind of images that rooms keep in their walls, the way poor families keep coins in flour, hidden but near, touched each day by hands that never spend them. A woman in a winter cloister bound a gospel with copper wire so a boy with a neat knife could not slice the last page clean. The wire took a nick. The nick turned green. The boy, trained to polish gilt from tools, rubbed until he could pretend the nick was ornament. A navigator crossed a gulf whose name the map had changed, found the old harbor where it had always been because fishermen believe more devoutly than cartographers, and wrote in his log a word that moderns translate as luck. A scribe erased his own footnote and wrote a prayer in its place. Lord, teach my hand to disobey the tidy impulse when it would harm the hungry. He was not fired. He was ignored. Ignoring is the economy's favorite kind of discipline. The Chronicle's panels bent as I turned them, then unbent with a little pride. The way paper takes a curl from warmth and then remembers it is of animal and refuses to stay deformed. A slip fell, the "late be early" petition, scribbled in a good heart's urgency. I put it back face up, as I had before, and anchored it with a pin that wasn't a pin, only a strip of leather that had learned to be weight by pretending. The petition can remain as indictment. Good intentions do not deserve fire. They deserve a longer hallway between impulse and stamp. I began to catalog my own body, because work without self-audit becomes this building grand, convinced, obedient to nothing but its own survival. My hand shook less. My breath, which had been imitating the corridor so dutifully that I feared it would forget its native rhythm, returned to me without asking to be thanked. My tongue felt the taste of iron diminish, though the air hadn't changed its recipe. The room was not becoming safer. I was becoming someone who required fewer guardrails. I performed then the smallest violence the Chronicle would permit. I added lines, not to the Chronicle, to myself. I opened a thin book I carried, meant for groceries and borrowed titles, and wrote a litany for the unspooling that could be kept small enough to evade confiscation. Say the names without asking permission. Read the dates aloud with your own century standing up straight in your chest. Refuse to trade a week for a story that leaves the hungry clever. Call miracle only what does not charge interest to memory. Keep the receipt for your attention and spend it where men are starving for witness. When I finished, the page smelled faintly of salt. Perhaps the water clock had learned to sweat. Across the room, the tin model city had acquired a selfish gleam. The thread from altar to stamp wanted to be plucked. Instruments are petty. They hate to be ignored. I walked to it, put my hand over the pins like a father over a toy that has been misused, and said, "No music tonight." I turned the model away from the water clock, as if two cousins who drink too quickly at weddings needed to sit at different tables. The silly gesture altered nothing, mechanical and slightly everything. It reminded me that I can be vulgar without being useless. At what felt like the midpoint between a vow and a yawn, I set the provincial calendars into a triangle. The corners touched. In the little tent of paper they made, you could hide a cup. I put the empty file box there, the one that had held blood ink tinctures of edits, and left its lid open so the air could nest in it. Theft is a stupid sacrament. I wanted the room to understand that the absence of a fluid had learned to breathe. A ritual without theft is friendliness. I am not friendly with altars that sell time in units small enough to avoid feeling like poverty. Do not imagine me pure. I almost spoke the oath, not from belief, from the hunger to understand fully the thing I hated. Knowledge in captivity will imitate the guards. I lifted my hand to the fuller's densest cluster of characters and placed 2 fingers where the oath-giver's palm was meant to rest. The sword did not warm. It did not cool. It noticed. That is enough to undo a life. No, I said to my own hand softly, as one might say to a hound pondering a neighbor's chickens. The hand obeyed. I was proud of it. A little. Pride can be a cheap indulgence. That night it was protein. The thread web sulked, most threads quiet now except for one, which fretted as if a clerk somewhere were aligning a stamp too early in his sleep. I laid the tiniest weight on that thread. A pebble from the sill of a window the corridor had tried to pretend didn't exist. It stilled. The relief felt indecent, like being forgiven without confession. I took it back immediately and whispered, "Work for it." The thread kept its manners. Even instruments can benefit from the pedagogy of expectation. When fatigue arrived, it did not swagger. It came with the courtesy of a guest who removes his shoes. I let it sit, but I did not feed it. Tiredness is where you unspool too far and begin to knit something just because knitting keeps your hands from choosing. I shut the panels one by one, listening for the small satisfactions: hinge, grain, spine, each closed with the consent of something no longer afraid of being opened. The groove kept its stain, which meant the blade would keep its vocation. You cannot cure a tool. You can only retire it with honor or lock it in a room where it can do no more harm than making rooms remember who they were made to serve. I put away the calendars and the map. I left the petition visible. I righted the tin city and left the thread slack. I turned the water clock on its axis so its mouth could rest. Relief is not always moral. Sometimes it is only maintenance. I told the room what I would do next, because rooms prefer to be spoken to directly. I will go upstairs and write what cannot offend. I will speak what cannot be unsaid. I will make copies of nothing and give them to no one. The copies will be people knowers without permission slips. The room listening did not argue. It had heard more heroic plans proposed and broken by better men. On the step, the shadow that had learned my pace kept it without mimicry. A companion, then. Shadows are truer friends than allies. They do not admire you, and therefore cannot betray you. At the silver plate, I paused. The motto threw back my breath. Memoria regitur. I answered it in the whisper of a clerk who has decided to go home with ink under his nails. Memoria testatur. The plate cooled to what metal owes the night and released me. Above, the basilica arranged itself into its usual innocence. Marble is the most talented liar in architecture. I made tea and let it be bad. I wrote a report that catalogued candles and said nothing, and in the white margin I wrote, "Small enough to embarrass a spy." A week cannot be punished and therefore should not be tried. When you begin to suggest to your own hand that time is not a person, you are ready to be hired by the balance. I underlined "not" twice. I carried my thin grocery book into the nave and sat on a pew tourists would bless with coins tomorrow. I copied the litany for the unspooling in a hand legible to strangers and folded it under the hymnals where the obedient thumbs had been taught to stay flat. A child would find it, or no one would. Both outcomes dignify paper. In the side aisle, I stood under a saint whose day had been smoothed into insignificance and whispered his stories back to him until my mouth learned his vowels. A cleaner passed with a bucket and smiled the smile of women who keep buildings from smelling like time. She did not ask me to move. Courtesy reproduces. On the way to my bed, I took a detour by the sacristy, where the old monk had coughed himself out of the record and touched the pillar he had leaned on. The stone remembered him the way cloth remembers a shoulder, a tenderness that transforms into strength before anyone notices. "We still drown," I told him, "because the dead are still hired to hear, but we are learning to swim with paper in our teeth." "I cannot prove," he agreed. "I can prove that the room learned to keep dry. Back in my cell, if a clerk's nest near the sub-basement deserves so holy a word, I laid the thin book beside the tape. I whispered the next lines into the machine, as if reciting to a sleepy companion, the way one tells a child what the morning will be, not because the future needs narrating, but because the body sleeps better when briefed. Tomorrow, I will ask the corridor a question with both hands. I will see whether the blade's patience is a mercy or a trap. I will count the breaths of the water clock. I will carry no ink the keepers can harvest. I will learn how to refuse without insulting the artifact. I will say the names again. I will use the receipts they handed me to buy disobedience. The tape smiled its little whir. Machines love being told the plan. It makes them feel they have schedules. The last thing I did before letting my eyes go was to write one sentence on a scrap and leave it on the threshold where my feet would step in the morning. Do not pay on time. The balance collects interest not in coins, but in habits. I have decided to be late for them, to keep their books open past closing, to force them to notice the lights still on. There is no heroism in this, only small, accurate rudenesses. When I slept, and I did, which is its own sacrament, the dream did not indulge me with visions of triumph. I sat in a classroom lined with music rests and tried to breathe through bars that did not require me, timing my stubborn inhalations so that the conductor would have to acknowledge my lungs as an instrument. The child from the primer lifted the corner of a page, and I pressed my thumb down on his thumb, not to stop him, but to help him lift more without tearing. Outside the window, a harbor wrote itself back into a curve. A rope went unpulled. A clerk waited for a bell that chose not to exhale. The room understood it had been admired enough and settled for being true. At 1 hour 52 minutes, I had begun with a wound. At 2 hours 11 minutes and 59 seconds, I ended with a bandage that was also a banner. Not triumph, fabric that keeps a place warm, so that the blood inside can decide to stay. I have unspooled what the balance braided and found under the knots, not chaos, but breath. If this is a victory, it is one so quiet the enemy will mistake it for routine. Good. Routine is the mask I will wear while we learn to count without charging life for the privilege of being recorded. Sleep, if you can. Not to forget, to gather weight. Tomorrow we will carry it into the light where the oath was taught to be inevitable. Tomorrow, the choir will breathe first and sing second. Tomorrow, we will show up with candles and questions and ask the ledger to speak plainly. I did not intend to make a sermon of what I've seen. Sermons are obliging things. They reach a conclusion on schedule. They offer a blessing measurable in breaths. They dismiss you to lunch. What I owe you is not an exit, but an entrance back into your own rooms, with their attics and shoeboxes and the margins where your family names go pale when no one touches them. Still, there must be a last chapter, because tapes end and lungs take turns with silence, and a confession without a coda is merely a leak. I went down the stair for the final time with the day folded in my pocket like a letter I had not earned the right to read. The silver plate remembered my palm with the civility of an old host who knows you have come to say goodbye. There was no ceremony. Doors that once performed their opening now shrugged and let the air pass. The corridor kept its ash ribs, the dates kept their incisions, the water clock kept its delicate vowels. The blade lay as it had always lain, drinking lamplight with the dignity of iron. The chronicle waited, open to the panel where costs and consolations make their uneasy ledger. I did not ask the room for permission. Rooms forgive that in the end initiative is simply another grammar for the breath they already possess. I set the provincial calendars out, not in a triangle this time, but in a line, as if I were laying place settings for an honest dinner. I placed the false harbor map atop the most stubborn one and let the curve show through as if a vein had decided to be visible. I brought the thread web forward and hung it so the knots shook a little in my presence, the way a choir adjusts its shoulders when a latecomer takes the back pew. Then I did what I had not dared. I took the copied oath from my pocket, the lines tracked and counter-tracked, the fourth breath underlined, the parasite clause I had added in my own hand, and I read it aloud, not to enact, but to convert. Words do not only bind, they can be persuaded to witness. When the line arrived that always washed me pale, let the interval serve, let the record conform, let the faithful not notice. I said it twice, and the second time I inverted it as if I were turning a glove. Let the interval refuse, let the record confess, let the faithful notice. The lamp did not flare, the blade did not sulk, but the water clock forgot a drop, and when it remembered, it was kinder. Here is what I will carry, I said to the room, to the chronicle, to the part of me that still loves tidy endings. Not the oath, not the whetstone, not the web. I will carry the method of refusal and the grammar of witness. I will carry names like weights and place them on the plates where your balances pretend not to feel them. I will not be late out of spite. I will be late out of accuracy when accuracy demands it. I will not call miracles the work of men who learned to move feasts around the hunger of others. I will not ask calendars to absolve us. To the King Nine, I wrote a short litany on a scrap pulled from the back of a ledger-thin paper, generous margins, and I left it in the groove where the blade's point rests, so the tool would have to touch it to sleep. If a week is moved, ask whom it dislodged. If a saint is softened, ask what question he once sharpened. If a harbor straightens, look for fishermen who refuse geometry. If an oath trims ink, say the names until the blade grows tired of listening. If a clerk knocks, pour tea and time the sand honestly. The scrap was nothing. That is exactly why it matters. The machine feeds on grand gestures. It is famished before small, consistent insolences. Across the chamber, the tin city gleamed its needy gleam. I turned it toward the wall and covered the thread with a cloth. Rest. I told the little conspiracies. You have had too much practice. To the water clock, I said, count, but do not scold. And to the dates carved in ash, hold your posture for those who come with questions you have not been trained to like. To the blade I spoke the last courtesy I could afford. You were misemployed. Sleep where you do no more harm than reminding. Steel is innocent, habit is not. There is a superstition that rooms require tokens to let you go, hair, buttons, a coin rubbed warm in your pocket. I left my pencil stub on the lectern and kept my breath. Breath is the only currency this place cannot counterfeit. I slid the panels shut and they closed, not like a secret, but like a book that understands it will be opened again by hands that have not learned my tremor. The hinge sighed once, the way old hinges do when they accept the principle of future elbows. At the stair, the shadow that had learned me ceased trying to lead. Companions know when to stop imitating. The silver plate cooled to the nobility of metal and let me go with a decorum that felt like affection. I did not turn to look as the seam knit itself back into wall. Nostalgia is a cousin of obedience. It teaches your feet to return even where they should only remember. Above, marble resumed its steady frauds. Innocence polished to a shine, history taught to echo. The nave pooled its hush. I carried the thin grocery book into the pew and copied out the last of the litany in a hand buyer's eyes can trust. I slid it under the hymnal, where obedient thumbs once learned to behave, and tucked a second copy into the coat pocket of the saint, with no day, the one we smoothed into a doorman so his questions would not trouble dinner. May the children fidget during the wrong verse. May someone ask why. Then, because a confession cannot end with inventory alone, I walked to the sacristy pillar where the old monk had wedged his cough into the stone's memory and placed my palm where his shoulder once taught the rock to soften. I am done cataloging your drownings, I told him. Now I will teach breath where you ran out. If the balance collects interest, I will collect witnesses. The pillar did what pillars do when they are impressed. It held. I left the basilica as morning rehearsed itself on pavements that believe more in shoes than in knees. The city had begun its day-long choreography of petty courage and practiced cruelties. Vendors pricing the weather, students pricing their doubts, magistrates pricing every verb that might embarrass a donor. I do not pretend that anything had changed. The schedules still reached for the same hour. The bells still made their citizens small. The news still whistled past with the satisfaction of proof. Only my lungs were new, and the part of my tongue that pronounces refusal without rancor. This is where you come in, if you are willing, and even if you are only willing the length of a breath. I cannot hand you the corridor. Corridors are local creatures and jealous of their stones. But you have your catacombs, a hall closet with a box of clippings no one quotes because the dates do not cooperate. A library shelf where the index pretends not to know the title you asked for. A plaque under a painting that calls a signature "School of" because someone's comfort was purchased with the artist's lunch. You also have your silver plates thresholds that warm under honest palms. They are not hammered with Latin. Some are labeled policy. Some don't make trouble. Some tradition. Some how things are done. Touch them. Doors are bored of being walls. If you cannot go under and would prefer not to, you can still practice a rite with no altar and no oath. It goes like this. Speak the names. When a record says unidentified, ask it twice and bring a third voice. Names outweigh adjustments. Read the date aloud. Reading is not recital, it is consecration. Dates that are heard resist being moved without witnesses. Keep the cheap receipts, the flyer, the minute, the photograph, with the thumb in the frame. These are evidence of attendance that no chancery knows how to price. Refuse tidy causes when the effect is messy. If a miracle is declared where experiments stand trembling in the wings, grant the experiment a microphone. Encourage disobedient courtesy. It is the tone the machine cannot process. The machine understands rage. It budgets for it. It does not understand the person who says, "No, thank you," and means both words. You will be told kindly, with the old, expensive kindness that you are making a fuss, that the ledger balances, that peace has been paid out to the faithful. You can smile and ask to see the interest rate. You can ask who calculated it, and whether the abacus had any beads missing where a saint should have been. You can ask if the harbor has been recently inspected for curvature. You can ask why, like a child who lifts the corner of a page, and when a shadow falls over the desk, you can lift harder, together. I fear only this, that fatigue will teach you to mistake your doubt for dessert, a thing you enjoy at the end of the day, rather than the bread you need to start it. Doubt is a muscle. It thrives on use, and it sleeps badly when neglected. If the city offers you a schedule that leaves no room for questions, eat into the schedule. Be late for the balance. Bring others late with you. Slow is not holy, but accurate can be. Accuracy is the one reverence machines learn to respect when enough hands insist on it at once. You asked for a thriller. I have given you something slower and, I hope, more dangerous. Here is the threat hidden in gentleness, attention that does not blink when it is told to be reasonable. Here is the promise hidden in confession. The penitent becomes a witness, and witnesses replicate in the wild. The custodes aquarii will endure. They are older than your mayor and cleverer than your most patient librarian. But they are allergic to daylight, shared among neighbors. Each question you ask aloud is a borrowed sun. Each story you refuse to let the ledger price is weather the machine cannot predict. If you crave a final image, take this: a kitchen table where no relics rest, only teacups, a loaf with a good heel, a grocery book with a list you can afford. You lay this tape down as if it were a blade, and it is not. It cannot cut. It can be sharpened only into attention. Around the table sit the people who will inherit your days. You say to them, "We will keep our calendars honest, not by believing harder, but by looking longer." You open an album and discover a name that once read unknown has learned to say itself, because you practiced saying it first. The clock over the stove ticks to the rhythm of lungs, not bells. Somewhere, a harbor curves. Somewhere, a saint gets his day back on a Tuesday because you lit a candle on the wrong evening and told the story until the right-sized holiness arrived. I will end where the corridor began, at the motto hammered into a metal that learned the temperature of hands. Memoria regitur. Memory is ruled. That sentence was an instruction here, a job description, a receipt. You have heard me argue the only answer I can say without rehearsing. Memoria testator. Memory bears witness. Rulers apply. Witnesses arrive. They do not require appointments. They do not present invoices. They carry candles and questions, and the kind of quiet that makes a room choose truth over performance. So, do not stop asking. Do not stop reading aloud. Do not stop telling the dates their true sizes. Do not stop tugging gently at the corners of pages. Do not stop showing the child where to place his thumb. Do not stop arriving late to the ledgers that expect you to be early. Do not stop counting breath instead of bells. The most dangerous thing to them is memory, coming home. If sleep takes you now, let it be an intermission, not an escape. Rest the way a hand rests on a door it intends to open. When morning rehearses itself, carry the small, accurate rudenesses into the street and practice the liturgy of witness between crosswalk and checkout line. An altar is only ever as strong as the next breath. Take one, lend one, light the next.